Hey guys, Black Vise here. I wanted to put together a video on layering, deconstructing, and designing kick drums. Kick drums are one of those things that I think can be most frustrating to new producers. They definitely were for me years ago, and I remember spending a lot of time over the first year or two constantly putting my stuff up against guys I looked up to and wondering why it just didn't stand up. And just wanted to share with you guys today a thought process that I have kind of developed on my, I'm sure other people have developed similar thought process, but for me this is just the approach I use now, and it's a way of deconstructing sounds that can be applied to things outside of kick drums. It's not a cookie cutter formula. It's something that can be used to apply to virtually all aspects of sound. So just on the 4 top tracks here, I have imported some kick drums from professionally released tracks from pretty well-known producers in a few different genres, and I'm just going to quickly play those for you. This is a house kick. Here's an electro house kick. Here's a Vengeance kick. Vengeance kick I put in just for comparison purposes, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about that afterwards. And here is a kick from a techno track. And here is a kick from my most recent track, one of my most recent tracks. Now, one thing I like to do as well, using your ears is extremely important, but it also can be helpful sometimes to look at waveforms to give you a better idea of what's going on. Typically, longer wave cycles are, well, not typically, always, they're indicative of lower frequencies, because lower frequencies travel greater distances compared to smaller frequencies, and you can generally see this kind of condensed color here is generally indicative of a click, and you can see some of them are more clicky than others. The techno one almost has none, whereas the electro house one and the house one are very have a lot of attack in that initial hit. I've developed this, or I've created this little frequency splitting chain that I like to use on my projects. It's just comprised of 4 multiband dynamics plugins. You could use just one, but you'd only be able to have a maximum of 3 different frequency bands to solo, whereas this one gives me a little more flexibility. They're not actually doing any compression. I've got all that bypassed, you can see here, but I am soloing each individual band. So I've got the highs, which is everything above 6K. Upper mids is everything between 6K and 1K. Lower mids is everything between 250 Hertz and 1K, and low is everything below. And I'll just show you quickly what that sounds like when I isolate some of those frequencies, for example, on the electro house kick. So I'll solo the highs, then the upper mids, lower mids, lows. And I just help, I find that this helps me hone in on specific areas of a sound. It doesn't need to be a kick drum, but it's part of the deconstructive approach, where if you can kind of hone in on a specific area within a sound, maybe you won't feel so overwhelmed, and you can figure out why it is that that particular portion of that sound sounds the way it does, as opposed to trying to figure it all out without using something like this. So I'm going to show you guys a couple examples of some kick drums I've made and how I processed and how I layered them. This first one actually is this one right here from my latest track, what's it called? Away From This, off my new EP. So it's this one right here. So this one's actually only been comprised of a couple different layers, and you'll hear certain people may say or may have said to you in the past that a kick drum needs a certain amount of layers to be successful. which I would definitely take with a grain of salt, because a kick drum needs as many layers as you want it to have. It's all about context. The most important thing I've learned probably over the years with kick drums is that more important than the kick drum itself is the context it's played back within, and that just means all the other sounds that it's working together with to form your piece. Its relationship with those elements will completely determine the impact and the power of the kick in the end. So with this particular kick drum, I've actually just got this low end piece here. You can hear it's this kind of breathy kick drum. If I just take off this low pass EQ I have on it, you can hear that it's a sample that's layered in itself with kind of a breathy layer, as well as a top percussion layer. I just wanted the bottom layer. I like the low end, but I also like the fact that when I low pass it, it kept a little bit of a ghost, excuse me, of what the what it once was. I've also got this kick, this top layer here, which is just another kick drum that I liked the click from. And you can just hear that without that, just a fairly standard kick. I just wanted the top end. In this particular kick example, there's obviously very little processing going on in the individual layers. The majority of the processing, in fact all of it, for the most part, is on the group. And in the other example I show you guys, I'm actually going to be showing you, I did things a completely different or the opposite way, and that just ties into what I mentioned before in the fact that this is a thought process. It's not necessarily a formula that you're going to do things the exact same way every time, which in my opinion would be boring anyway. This keeps things interesting, and as long as you have the knowledge of the underlying principles, you can apply this to anything. So with this particular group, I actually used an Ableton Live, sorry, not Ableton Live. I used a third-party chain comprised of some plugins here, and afterwards I'm going to show you another chain I've made with just Ableton plugins to show you that you don't necessarily need these. But just real quick, it's a FabFilter Saturn, a Transient Shaper, a PSP Vintage Warmer, a Pro Q, and an L2. And if I just keep those on, that's how it sounds. Essentially, the key to processing a lot of these kick drums is understanding frequency distribution and understanding what type of processing you can get away with in certain frequency bands within a sound. And a lot of that has to do with manipulating processes like saturation, distortion, EQ, and compression, and knowing how that will affect certain aspects of the sound. And a lot of that it's always going to be trial and error, but if you have a rough idea of what you're shooting for, generally you'll end up there in the end. I don't want to underemphasize the fact that picking sounds and layers that initially go together is extremely important. Go together well, I should say. That's definitely just as important as the processing. You're going to make life a lot easier for yourself by picking sounds that work well together. But in order to make sounds that are kind of competitive with these types of tracks, if that is what you want, some people, this would absolutely be not what they want. In their opinion, what we would be doing is way too overkill, but that's another discussion. This is not subjective opinion. This is just, I'm just showing you some tools you can use to have kick drums that have perceived loudness that's competitive with a lot of the tracks that you might be hearing in the club or might be hearing wherever you go. So if I just turn these off, I'm just going to keep the limiter on in the chain, and that's because that is just simply bringing the volume up to a uniform level, and you'll hear a drastic difference with these turned off. It just sounds like this. So just one by one, I'm going to quickly turn them on. This is what the Saturn does. And Saturn is actually one of my favorite plugins. It's a multi-band saturation distortion plugin. And here what I'm actually doing is just taking everything above 300 Hertz and increasing the output level quite a bit. as well as adding some tape warmth, which is a tape saturation emulation. This transient shaper is simply, I'm just using it to introduce a little bit of soft clipping, which will transparently kind of shave off some of the peaks. It's the Shack Audio transient shaper. I really like it. PSP Vintage Warmer, I'm just using to apply a little bit of compression and limiting, very gentle, and that's just kind of rounding it out and giving it a little bit more aggression. So without it, I'll A/B it, and you can hear how it sounds with and without. That's off, and this is on. So the perceived loudness is increased a little bit, and I feel it rounds it out a little bit as well. And here, lastly, I've got the Pro Q, which is just taking out a couple of the resonances I didn't like in the sound. So that, with it off, that's with it on. It just smooths it out. I just like the way that's it sounded a little more. And so yeah, I just made this Ableton chain just before I made the video to quickly show you guys that you don't necessarily need all these third-party plugins to do this type of stuff. And I've actually key mapped the on-off of each to P, so I'm just going to quickly play it back and switch between the two, and you can hear the difference. So that's the third party, and here's the Ableton. So really not too huge of a difference. The Ableton one sounds a little bit colder and a tiny bit thinner to me, but that may very well be because I didn't spend enough time fine-tuning things. And you can see here, if I just open it up, that I've actually built this on the fundamental principle of this frequency splitting chain that I had applied up here to isolate the different bands. And all I've done is I've applied some gain staging and saturation, compression and EQ in varying amounts. On the highs, I've increased the output and applied a little bit of saturation. On the upper mids, I've applied some saturation and output gain. Lower mids, I got a couple saturators in serial with some compression. And on the lows, I've just simply, I think, increased the output gain a little bit. And I did apply some more processing to the group as well, affecting all of the bands. So just for comparison purposes, just to show you, if I were to use neither of these chains and just simply had applied a limiter, that would bring the volume up to the same reading as what these were, which was minus 6, excuse me. You can just tell that sounds drastically different to with it on. So I'll just quickly compare. That's just the limiter. So not only is the perceived loudness significantly different, but we've also drastically changed the character in the way that I wanted for that particular track. You could change it in whatever way you wanted. It's all about kind of following your whatever is inspiring you and your intuition, and just kind of going with that until you have something you're satisfied with. So the second example I've done here, I've actually done things a little bit differently, but I'm still applying the same core principles that we've talked about with deconstructing, our process of deconstructing and reconstructing sounds with a vague idea of what it is we're trying to accomplish. So I've separated this. This one's actually comprised of 3 layers, and I've got a low, a mid, and a high layer. And I've actually applied much more minimal processing to the group and more processing to the individual bands on this particular example. So just to start off, I'll show you how I chose the top layer for this particular sound, which is just this spring-plated hat sample. And I just like the texture in that sound, kind of simple as that. It's really about listening for sounds, and when you're listening to sounds, listening to the texture and the color, and see if there's something kind of inherently in there that you feel like you might be able to do something fun with, or maybe you just like it and you want to integrate it somehow. I just like the sound. It's as simple as that. So I wanted to use that as a foundation for what was going to be my top layer. So I actually imported that into a sampler, and I've applied some envelope shaping to the amplitude, as well as some, I applied a little bit of FM, as well as some pitch envelope, and I added quite a bit of soft clipping within the Ableton sampler, as well as I did a little bit of manipulation on the transposition and the spread, and that sounds like this. So just kind of a clicky hat sound, and all I've got there is a little bit of high passing after the fact. On this mid sample, this is a bit more interesting. It sounds like this. And this particular sound I've actually driven quite hard with a saturator, but if I just bypass this chain right here, you hear that was just kind of a mid-rangey kick drum, and I really just wanted to take the mids of that and really drive them and kind of see what I came up with, and I ended up liking it. So the EQ in this actually plays a really big part, because and this relates to understanding what you can get away with certain frequencies. For example, a saturator that's been driven this hard will sound completely different if you haven't cut away a lot of those low frequencies. So just to show you what I mean real quick, I'm going to bypass this EQ and listen to how different this sounds. So this is with EQ, and this is without. So a really kind of hard style sounding kick, just completely obliterated, distorted. Maybe that's what you want. That's definitely not what I wanted for this. So if you cut away those frequencies, you're going to get a completely different result. And in this case, this particular example, the order in with which you place the plugins in is just as important as the effects themselves. So for example, if I had done this saturator prior, it was still going to affect those low frequencies before going into the EQ, so you'd still get a sound like this. So again, not what we're looking for. So it's just something that I thought was worth mentioning. You cut away those, you can get away with a lot more with affecting kind of these mid frequencies. And the low layer, I've just applied a little bit of, well, quite a bit of low passing, just with a simple Ableton EQ. If I were just to quickly turn this off, you'll hear that this sound was a very predominantly low sound anyway. There wasn't a lot of high-end information on it. This is what it sounds like with and without. So there really wasn't much there, but I wasn't interested in what was there anyway, so I just cut that away. And I've actually, all I've done with this particular layer is applied a little bit of glue compression. Typically with low end, when you're creating the low end, whether you're synthesizing it or you're using a sample like I've done, if you want it to be clean on a club system, there's really not much you want to do to it. Maybe some gentle saturation or some compression just to even it out, even it out a little bit. And in this case, the glue tightened it up a little bit as well. I've key mapped this utility plugin to my keyboard, which, because the compressor itself is actually increasing the output gain by a couple dB, but just to show you what the compressor is actually doing if I were to volume match it with a utility. So you can see right here, it's peaking around 8.6, and if I switch the utility, it's peaking around 8.3, or negative 8.3, which is actually a little bit louder. Now listen. Unfortunately, you're going to need to have a decent pair of headphones or some speakers with a relatively low response. If you've got laptop speakers, this won't come through, so I'm sorry about that. But if you listen, you'll be able to hear that there's actually a significant difference when we A/B these two. So here is the utility, and I'm just going to switch it to the glue. Back to utility. So the glue is actually, in my opinion, increasing the perceived loudness of the sound. Not a huge amount, but it's all about, a lot of the times it's about subtlety with this type of stuff, and because of the specific settings I've used on this, it's actually tightening up the sound as well. Typically on a compressor, if you have a shorter release, the shorter the release, the more pumping artifacts you're going to get in a sound. Longer releases will tend to result in a more transparent sound, and a shorter attack is obviously going to squish those peaks a lot quicker, as opposed to a longer attack which will let a bit more through, and ratio and threshold are pretty self-explanatory. But in this case, I like the glue because I found it tightened it up a bit. It felt a bit less flabby, and it to me made it seem a little bit more prominent. With the low end, it's really about super subtle tweaks as well as volume matching it correctly relative to your other layers in the sound. Cool. And so on the actual group bus here, I've actually, you can see I've got next to nothing. All I've got is a little bit of an EQ with a few cuts, as well as a limiter that's just bringing up to the unity gain with the other kicks I have here. So if you just want to, and this span is just an analyzer, Voxengo. It's a great free analyzer if you want to check it out. So yeah, so let's just listen to it all together. So really aggressive. It's more of a electro house kind of kick drum, short, kind of more in your face, and that is suited towards higher BPMs. Typically you want this shorter, snappier kick drums in those genres, so you can leave a lot more room to put more or different low end elements in there between the gaps. So let's just quickly compare this kick drum we just made. I just made this before the video, to the one we just went over before, and then to a couple of these. So it's arguably even more aggressive than some of these. So in that way, we've kind of achieved what we're going for. And really quickly, guys, the last thing I want to show you, or quickly show you, is that depending on what genre you're making, whether you're using longer subtails or shorter, the tuning of the kick drum is something you're going to want to think about if that's going to be working in conjunction with other low-end elements. If you're making something that's kind of maybe in the slower BPM ranges, or even some people like to do it even with the faster ones. Sometimes I do it, sometimes it just depends. But with this particular example here, I just have this long subtone. And just be mindful of the fact that, say you had this other, for example, I've got this operator here which is also playing a sub. I'm just going to play them together. You want to be careful to watch out for things like phasing when you have frequency overlap, especially in these really low frequencies. So for example, if I turn this bass off, you can hear that it's peaking around -6.6, and if I turn this on, the volume actually decreases, and that's a result of negative phase cancellation that's happening here. So if I were just to apply this utility plugin on here, which is just inverting the polarity of this particular signal, you're going to see that we're going to get frequency doubling. Which generally both of these are kind of undesirable, or maybe it's what you want, but to be aware of it is a good thing anyway. So if we were just to have this on and then turn it on, so you'll find now that we've got the signals increase from -6.6 to -5 dB. So that's just something to always think about if you're going to. Generally, I try never to overlap frequencies like this, but if for some sort of creative purpose you decided that was something you want to do, just understand that these sorts of things will happen, and that way you can maybe manipulate the phase to whatever it is you're trying to integrate it with. Finally, I just want to show you guys a kick drum that I made probably in the first year that I was making music, just to show you guys how crappy I was too as well when I first started doing this. So this is actually comes from, I have my own little sample library here that I've just built up over the years, and I definitely recommend that you do this as well with your projects. Save your samples as you go, and that way you have kind of this long journal entries that you can look at on a longer timeline and compare to kind of old stuff you were making, and it's just kind of a fun thing to do anyway. So this particular kick, I've applied some limiting just so that the output is same as the other ones, around -6.3, and if I just quickly A/B that with the other one we just made a moment ago, that I made right before the video. So it just sounds ridiculously small and ridiculously thin compared to those. And this was back when I would spend a lot of time really scratching my head, figuring out why, when I was slamming everything into a compressor, it wasn't still sounding competitive with the guys I was trying to compare myself to. And that came with time, and it came with an understanding of how to manipulate these frequencies with those processing techniques that I showed you guys. So just in closing, I want to quickly say that I know what it's like to feel discouraged. I've gone through those phases where initially you feel uncertain about something, which will lead to doubt, which will lead to kind of feeling lost, which will lead to feeling frustrated, and that's never a fun thing when you're trying to make music and improve, and you've acknowledged that you want to commit to it, but you find yourself just being frustrated day in, day out. The reason I wanted to share this particular way of working with you guys is that I found that you can apply this deconstructive approach to all aspects of sound, and it can be a really great way to avoid feeling overwhelmed when comparing yourself to other pieces of work that you're using as a particular reference. For example, comparing a whole track can be something that's extremely overwhelming, whereas if you were to dial in on specific aspects of that track and aspects of yours, you can really work from there. And that doesn't necessarily need to be sound design. That could be something like the way some patterns are evolving over time, or the way particular sounds are interacting. That stuff is just important. And one thing I've definitely learned over the years is that, as important as it is to understand this type of stuff, this design and this processing is really, really dependent on the way that you choose to arrange sounds in space and time, and the relationships that all these sounds form together. The context of the piece basically is the most important thing in the songwriting aspect, and I think that's the big life commitment. So understanding these fundamental things is good, but I'm still working every day to try and improve those other skills, and I feel like I'll probably be doing it forever. But hopefully that helps you guys out. If you guys liked this video and you stuck with me through the whole thing, please check out my music on SoundCloud, or check out some of my other pages, and like, comment, subscribe, and let me know if you have any comments about this, or if you guys maybe are having a hard time creating some of those racks I could throw up, maybe that frequency splitting rack or the processing rack for free. Yeah, let me know in the comments. Okay, take care, guys. Bye.